Okay, so we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today. Um, this Reddit post is something that's been making the rounds online, and it's definitely sparked a lot of discussion. Basically, it's about a woman who is feeling really scared and just turned off by sex altogether after her husband kind of pressured her into having anal sex. Even though, and this is the part that really gets me, even though she told him she wasn't comfortable and it was actually hurting her.
Yeah, this situation is a tough one because it really brings up a lot of those complex issues around consent and what that looks like within a marriage and, of course, communication. And it also brings up the possibility of some trauma, which we can definitely dig into more.
Right, and it's a sensitive topic, obviously, so I think it's important for us to just be mindful of that as we talk about this. These are issues that could be challenging for people to hear about and even triggering. So, yeah, just kind of setting the scene here. The original poster, she shared her experience on Reddit, and the way she described it, the language she used, it was intense. She straight up used the word forced, which like immediately made me think, whoa, wait, are we talking about consent? Even
Yes.
within a marriage?
Exactly. And that's a point that can't be stressed enough. Being married doesn't mean that consent goes out the window. Every sexual act still requires consent from both people. And you're right, that word forced that she used, it definitely raises the question of whether this could be classified as marital rape, which is unfortunately something that does happen.
It's not something you want to think about, but it is a reality for some people, for sure.
Yeah.
And the response on Reddit, whoa, people were not holding back. Commenters were very much on her side, and a lot of them were calling out the husband's actions as abusive.
The comments were definitely strong. There was a lot of anger and outrage with people sharing their own experiences, almost like they needed to validate what this woman was saying and show her that what her husband did was serious. It seemed like this story really hit a nerve with a lot of people.
There was one comment that really stuck with me. It said, can you imagine performing a sex act on him that was so painful he cried and didn't want to be intimate anymore? Ask yourself why he can then. That really got to me because it
Yeah.
just shows the complete lack of empathy and the fact that it was all one-sided.
That comment was a powerful way to point out the double standard that often exists. The husband expects his wife to endure pain for him, but the thought of him experiencing any discomfort himself is completely unacceptable, which says a lot about the power imbalance, how he sees her.
For sure. And there was another commenter who said that she had been pressured into anal sex by her ex-husband for years, and she even felt like she had to let him record it. And get this, later on, those videos were used against her when they were getting divorced.
Yeah.
It's scary to think how a situation that might seem, I don't know, small at Soest can spiral and have these lasting impacts.
So that story is just heartbreaking. And it shows how devastating the long-term effects of sexual coercion can be, especially when it happens within a marriage. It can lead to feelings of violation, a sense of betrayal, and just deep trauma that can take a long time to heal from.
And it's not even just about the physical act itself, right? It's about how it destroys the trust and intimacy that should be at the heart of a healthy relationship. The original poster even said she felt afraid of her husband and couldn't enjoy being intimate with him at all anymore. It's sad to hear how much this has affected her whole being.
Let's try and unpack the psychology behind this a bit. Being coerced into sex, even by your spouse, it can create these deep emotional wounds. It can lead to fear and anxiety and even a complete aversion to sex altogether. It's a pretty common reaction to trauma, and healing from those experiences, it takes time and support for sure.
I think you make a good point about the human element here. It's easy to get caught up in the legal stuff and be angry about what happened, but we can't forget that there's a real person here who's hurting. Her pain is valid, and it's important that we acknowledge that.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good time to just say, to anyone listening who might be going through something similar, you are not alone. There are people who can help. There are organizations like the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAINN, that provides support and guidance to survivors of sexual assault and abuse, and it's all confidential.
Yeah, that's so important to remember. You can find RAINN online at rainn.org or by phone at 800-656-HOPE. Reaching out for help, it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. I think that's something we all need to hear sometimes.
Speaking of support, I do want to point out the amazing community we have here. The messages we get from listeners sharing their stories, offering encouraging words, and saying how much they appreciate these deep dives. It's really heartwarming and shows how much this podcast means to people.
I agree. It's humbling for sure. To know that these conversations we're having are actually making a difference is pretty incredible. And if you are enjoying these discussions and want more, make sure you subscribe to Voices of the Soul wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really means a lot to us, and it helps other people find these important conversations too.
And if you want to connect with our host more personally, you can check out her YouTube channel.
Yes. Find me, Shauna Pelage, on YouTube. I share more of my thoughts and reflections there on stuff like relationships, personal growth, and all the crazy things that come with life.
Now let's get back to that Reddit post. One thing that really jumped out at me from the comments was how many people were able to see the red flags in the original poster's story and offer support right away. It just shows how much collective wisdom there is out there and how powerful online communities can be in giving people validation and solidarity.
That's true. A lot of the commenters were quick to point out that what the wife experienced fit the definition of marital rape, even though she might not have realized it herself. They made it clear that consent given under pressure or because you're afraid, it's not really consent at all.
And that's where things get interesting, right? We see this difference between what the original poster actually went through and how she's understanding it. She's obviously hurt and traumatized, but she doesn't seem to fully grasp how serious what happened really was.
I wonder if that has something to do with how society views marriage and the pressures that come with it. The idea that wives should always be there for their husbands sexually, no matter what they themselves want or feel.
That's a great observation, and it's something we should definitely explore more. Maybe in the next part of our deep dive, we can look closer at those cultural influences that might play a role in these kinds of situations.
So yeah, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll keep unpacking this important and complex topic.
So picking up on that idea of cultural influences, one of the things that kept coming up in the comments was the role that pornography might play in shaping people's expectations, especially around anal sex.
Oh yeah, for sure. I was thinking the same thing. Quite a few commenters were concerned about how mainstream porn often shows anal sex in a way that completely ignores consent and preparation, and even the fact that it can be painful.
Right, and those kinds of depictions can create this totally unrealistic expectation and lead to people just not caring about their partner's well-being. It's pretty scary to think about how easy it is to access that kind of content and how it might be messing with young people's understanding of what a healthy sexual relationship actually looks like.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How can we do a better job of teaching young people about healthy sexuality and consent if they're getting their information from sources that normalize coercion and downplay the importance of communication? Well, that's a big problem.
Absolutely. We need to be having more open and honest conversations about these things, conversations that go beyond just the mechanics of sex and really get into the emotional and ethical side of intimacy.
And it's not just about educating young people. It's about challenging those harmful societal norms that perpetuate this idea that men are entitled to certain things in relationships. A lot of the commenters pointed out how the husband in this story seemed to be putting his own pleasure above his wife's well-being, like it didn't even matter to him.
Yeah, that disregard for her feelings, it's a red flag. It speaks to the whole power dynamic that can happen in relationships where one person feels like they have the right to control the other person, especially when it comes to sex.
There was one commenter who actually used the term coercive control to describe what the husband was doing. They mentioned how using emotional manipulation, intimidation, and even isolating someone from their support system can be a precursor to physical violence. It's kind of terrifying when you think about it, but it's so important to be able to spot those patterns.
For sure. Coercive control, it's a very serious form of abuse, and it can be hard to recognize because it's often subtle and sneaky. It's all about gaining power over your partner, not through physical force, but through these little things that over time chip away at their sense of self and their ability to make their own choices.
It makes you wonder if the husband in this story even realizes the damage he's causing. Maybe he's just so focused on what he wants that he's completely oblivious to how his actions are affecting his wife.
It's possible. And that's why communication is so crucial. Even when you're in a close relationship, you can't assume that the other person knows what you're thinking or feeling. You have to be upfront about your needs, your boundaries, what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. And you have to be equally receptive to the signals your partner is giving you, whether they're saying it out loud or not.
It's easy to fall into patterns, especially when you've been in a relationship for a while. You get comfortable, maybe start taking things for granted, and you stop really seeing and hearing your partner.
That's so true. And that's why it's crucial to make open and honest communication a priority in your relationships. It's about making sure both people feel safe to say what they need and want, even if those things don't always match up perfectly.
And it's about being willing to listen, really listen to your partner, even when what they're saying is tough to hear or makes you uncomfortable. One commenter who said she was a military wife shared a story that I haven't been able to get out of my head. She talked about how her husband became more and more controlling after he left the service, and it eventually led to domestic violence and assault.
That's a powerful reminder that domestic violence can happen to anyone, no matter what their background is or what their social status is. And it often starts with these seemingly small acts of control and manipulation that can escalate into something really dangerous if they're not addressed.
Her story really made me think about how important it is to trust your gut. If something feels off in your relationship, there's probably a reason for that. And there's no shame in asking for help, whether it's from a friend, family member, or a professional.
You got it. There are so many resources out there for people who are dealing with abuse or are worried about the health of their relationship. Organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline are there to provide confidential support and guidance 24/7. You can find them online or call 1-800-799-SAFE-A.
I also want to mention that there were some comments from survivors who talked about their own journeys of healing and recovery from similar experiences. What they had to say was full of hope and resilience, like they were saying to the original poster. You can get through this. There's a brighter future waiting for you.
Yeah, that was one of the most inspiring parts of this whole conversation, seeing the strength and courage of people who have been through so much and come out on the other side. It's a good reminder that even when things seem really dark, healing is possible and there's always hope.
Reading through those comments, I felt this wave of community and support, like everyone was coming together to say, you're not alone in this. What happened to you was wrong, and you deserve to be heard and believed.
And that message is so powerful. It shows how important it is to talk about these things, to break the silence around these issues, and to create a culture where survivors feel safe to share their stories without being judged or shamed.
This whole discussion has been a real eye-opener, for sure. It's clear that marital rape happens more often than we might think, and it often stays hidden because of the shame and secrecy that surround it. The comments on this Reddit post really show how important it is to get rid of the taboo and have open and honest conversations about consent, power dynamics, and the potential for abuse in intimate relationships.
Couldn't agree more. By talking about these things openly, we can start to challenge those harmful norms and beliefs that contribute to these situations. And we can start to create a world where it's safer for people to come forward and ask for help and find healing.
And speaking of support and healing, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the amazing community that's formed around this podcast. We've gotten so many heartfelt messages from listeners who have shared their stories, offered words of encouragement, and said how much they appreciate these deep dives. It's really touching to see how much this podcast means to people.
It really speaks to the power of being vulnerable and creating a space where people feel like they can open up about their experiences and connect with others who understand what they're going through.
You said it. And if you're finding value in these conversations, please think about subscribing to Voices of the Soul wherever you listen to your podcasts. It means the world to us to know that these discussions are resonating with you. And it helps us reach a wider audience so more people can benefit from these conversations.
And if you're looking for more ways to connect with these topics and engage with them, check out our host's YouTube channel.
Yes. You can find me, Sean Pelage, on YouTube, where I share more personal thoughts on things like relationships, self-discovery, and all the ups and downs of life. It would be great to connect with you there, too.
Okay, so as we move toward the last part of our deep dive, let's shift gears a bit and focus on something that came up a lot in the Reddit comments. The role of language and how it shapes our perception of these complex issues.
That's a good point. It's something I noticed, too. It was almost as if the original poster was struggling to find the words to describe what she'd been through, like her experience and the language available to talk about it didn't quite line up.
Exactly. She seemed to be avoiding the word rape, even though a lot of people in the comments were saying that's exactly what it was.
Right. And instead of focusing on the violation, she seemed more caught up in her own emotional reaction, talking about how she was scared of sex and wanted to change how she feels so she could enjoy it again.
And that brings up some really interesting questions. How do societal norms, our own personal beliefs, sometimes stop us from fully recognizing how bad something really was?
It's like there's a gap between what she knows in her head and what she's feeling in her heart.
That's a great way to put it. And that's something we're going to explore more in the final part of our deep dive, where we'll dig into the nuances of language, perception, and what it takes to heal from trauma.
Okay, so we were talking about language and perception, and one thing that really struck me was how many people in the comments were saying, hey, you got to use clear language when you're talking about these things.
Yeah, there was a definite push to get away from all those euphemisms and minimizing language and just call things what they are.
Like a lot of people were saying that using words like rape and sexual assault, even though they're hard to say, can actually be empowering for survivors.
Right. It's about taking back your power through language. When you name what happened accurately, it challenges the stigma and the shame that often goes along with these experiences.
There was this really interesting conversation about the difference between consent and compliance, too. Someone pointed out that sometimes people might go along with sexual acts, even if they don't really want to, maybe out of fear or because they don't want to cause a conflict, or even just because they feel obligated.
That's a really important distinction, and it shows how subtle coercion can be. Real consent, it has to come from a place of genuine willingness and enthusiasm from everyone involved. It can't be forced or manipulated.
One of the commenters used this analogy that really stuck with me. They said, imagine someone's holding a gun to your head and asking for your wallet. You might hand it over, but that doesn't mean you're giving it as a gift. It's still robbery.
Oh, wow, that's a perfect example, and it totally applies to consent. Just because someone says yes doesn't mean they actually want it. We have to pay attention to the power dynamics in the situation and realize that consent that's given under pressure isn't real consent.
You know, this whole conversation has really shown me how important communication is, not just when it comes to sex, but in every part of life.
Totally. It's about creating a culture where people feel like they can speak up about their needs and their boundaries and where those boundaries are respected. And it's about being willing to listen to and respect what other people need and where their boundaries are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think of the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that marital rape is a real problem, and it happens more often than we might realize. This conversation has shown us how crucial it is to talk about these things, to challenge those harmful ideas that keep it hidden, and to create a space where survivors feel safe to come forward and ask for help.
I could agree more. And I really hope this has made people think about the complexities of consent, the power dynamics that can exist in relationships, and how what society expects of us can affect how we understand these issues.
I hope it's also sparked some conversations, whether it's with yourself or with the people around you, about how important open communication, empathy, and respect are in every relationship.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. The original Reddit post we talked about was mostly focused on how the husband's actions affected his wife. But what about the husband? What could be going on with him? Are there underlying issues or insecurities that he needs to address? I think that's something worth thinking about as we try to understand the complicated world of relationships and intimacy.
That's a great point. It reminds us that every story has multiple sides, and to really understand what's going on, we need to be empathetic and willing to consider all the factors that contribute to people's behavior.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
And remember, if you or someone you know is going through something similar, there is help out there. Organizations like RAINN provide confidential support and guidance for survivors of sexual assault and abuse.
And if you enjoyed this conversation and want to learn more about relationships, personal growth, and just being human, make sure you subscribe to Voices of the Soul wherever you get your podcasts.
And you can find our host, Shauna Palage, on YouTube if you'd like to connect with her directly.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those voices of the soul alive.